Chris has asked me to talk about my work, but also to reflect on themes that loosely arise from the exhibition, Forging Alliances, here in the museum. I'm going to balance this talk by reading part of it from text, but also talking to slides. So I hope you bear with me with this approach. The title of this talk, A Sense of Place, is not really a statement, it's more of an aspiration. It refers to several aims. The ongoing search for a creative locus, my identity as an artist, but it also refers to the search of place to position ceramics, specifically pottery, within the world of contemporary art. And lastly, it refers to a search for a place to position art within our lives. How integrated is art within contemporary culture? Is art truly an essential part of daily or domestic life? Or is it a recreational activity that we indulge in as a part-time activity with the requisite weekend trip to the gallery, museum or exhibition? I might be a bit of a romantic, but I like to think that art should be a fundamental and fully integrated part of our lives. The question is, how do we achieve this? I'm a potter, and I've said it. I've said the P word, so forgive me. A very part-time academic, and I also write about 20th century and contemporary ceramics. I'm a product of English urban art schools, but was also an apprentice to a Leach-trained potter in rural Cornwall. Overall, I have now worked in London for a little over 40 years. I'm going to show quite a lot of images, many of which are now rather embarrassing. I'm doing this in particular for you students, because it's all too easy for artists to show off and pretend that making art is easy and painless. It somehow just happens, and that unlike you, we never make mistakes. We do. The intent, however, is to reveal the thoughts and ideas behind my work, and hopefully they collectively add up to a journey of sorts, an attempt to locate myself somewhere, to find a place. I've included 2 quotes on the screen that span the best part of 50 years, almost half a century, and that reveal very different attitudes to appreciating art and illustrate what I regard as a great paradox: the art of talking about art, whether it be visual or a tactile experience. I sympathise with Cardu's position, but we humans value language, so on balance I probably agree with McGregor. But art expresses ideas and emotions that we take in through the body's senses. Hopefully, something such as looking at a painting by Rothko or handling a pot by Hans Koper, we will never be able to fully explain through words. If we could, then there would be no point in making anything. It would be time to give up. So a little reluctantly, I will take the McGregor route today and use words as well as objects, or images of objects, to talk about ideas and try and contextualise my practice within contemporary art. And finally, I hope to overcome the maxim attributed to various people, from Oscar Wilde to Gore Vidal or Winston Churchill, but actually penned by the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, of how Britain and America are 2 nations divided by a common language. I can't promise to make myself understood, but I will try. I went to college in a traditional English London art school, and this was its name before they changed it to the University of the Arts. So when I went there, it still had its old title of Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts, and it's one of London's oldest art schools, and people such as Roger Fry and William State Murray learnt to throw there back in the very early part of the 20th century. And like any good young student, I was a product of the era I grew up in. And all you have to do is cast your mind back to the 1970s and what was happening then. And minimalist art, and Donald Judd and Solar Wit, and a teacher of mine called Glenys Barton was one of the dominant strands and factors of contemporary practice at the time. And even Frank Stella, with his maxim, what you see is what you get. And ultimately that kind of attitude was something that made me dissatisfied with a way of working that I felt was a rather kind of cerebral and intellectual way, and somehow had moved me away from the original reasons of which I was attracted to making pots. I was dealing with ideas of perception and illusion, and as I said, it felt like a game. It felt like a bit of an intellectual exercise, and there wasn't a great deal of, I felt, depth to it. So fortunately, I was able to have a second chance in education, and I went to, as you call it, grad school. And the Royal College of Art is only a grad school. There's no undergraduate courses there. And it's quite an imposing and kind of difficult place to work in because it has a reputation which you feel you can never live up to. But at the Royal College of Art, I said in my interview that I wasn't going to make the work I'd made in grad school, and they asked me what I was going to make, and I said I didn't know. And they were brave enough to take a gamble on me, and I truly didn't know. And at the RCA, I sent myself back to the beginning again, a kind of self-imposed return to basics. And I started to investigate ways of making pots. And I tried coining and pinching and carving and slabbing. And eventually I realized that the wheel was the most appropriate way. It just seemed to be just completely the right way to start to learn about making pots. Just a bit of context. Making pots in the end of the 1970s and then throughout the 80s, and even now into, where are we, the noughties or the teens of the 21st century. In England, and I can't talk for the States, well I can a bit because I knew what was happening here in the 80s and 90s, but I don't really know what's happening in depth here now. But making pots hasn't been kind of critically revered for quite a long while. It's an activity which is seen as passé and traditional and a bit boring and not kind of truly kind of intellectually engaging with modern ideas. Fortunately, when I was at the RCA, I came across someone who turned out to have a huge impact on my practice, whose name was Philip Rawson. And I know Chris and I were talking about Philip Rawson's book yesterday called Ceramics. Out of curiosity, hands up who's read Ceramics? 3 people. Okay, I don't know how many of you are in the theatre, but I can't make a high enough recommendation that everyone else should go and buy, if you can, a second-hand copy of it, because it's a truly brilliant book. And Philip Rawson just bypassed all the kind of political, with a small p, debates, all the kind of fashion, all the small world infighting of ceramics, and cut to the chase and started to talk about and wrote about pots in a global sense. And it was a truly radical and visionary approach because he was looking at pots in a kind of transnational way and over history. And it was just such a kind of interesting and uplifting way to think about these objects which are so kind of fundamental and simple apparently simple. So I was fortunate enough to meet Rawson. Now I was making some terrible work, but if I can kind of justify myself, it was early days of thinking about pots. So this was about drawing a pot in a sketchbook and then making that drawing in 3D, and then again a rather kind of convoluted and I think a kind of concept-led, downward-led approach. But I started to try to think about pots in the round and think about the relationship between form and surface, which I think is a really fundamental part of pottery and something that is really unique. Pottery isn't painted sculpture, and it's not paintings in the round. Pottery occupies a kind of a very distinct physical space, and again Rawson will talk very eloquently about that, and the space of bowls in particular. And Brooks, your bowl in the show last night, the very brightly coloured one, the pink of that colour, and then I don't know what the yellow applied elements were, but there's a very extraordinary kind of spatial relationship and dynamic going on there, and that's because it's all done inside the curve, that volume of a bowl. So Rawson, as I say, was a huge influence. I left college and set up a studio, and this was a studio in Brixton, which was kind of quite notorious in the time, and I set up with fellow friends who had been at college with me, and pots maybe started to get a little bit more kind of sophisticated. So this was a pot that's thrown, and again the idea of form and surface. So this is a very simple idea of a form, and taking a vertical line and drawing that line on the form, and then the line reflecting the outward volume of the body of the pot. So trying to kind of integrate form and surface in a very simple way. But if you can see, it's got a slightly kind of rippled effect, and that's a detail because the surface was burnished. And even at this stage, and I was really feeling my way, I realised that touch was a very important aspect of making pots, and so I would burnish this very high-fired dense porcelain and compress the surface. And this was something that you don't necessarily see with the eye, but when you pick it up, your fingers register. And touch and our fingertips are so incredibly sensitive that they pick up many, many details that the eye doesn't necessarily appreciate. And that's why I did it. So it wasn't something that was obvious, but it was something to be discovered. But I felt I was kind of stuck in a bit of a groove, and that was a groove of making pots, or as you would say, we say vases, you say vases. They were kind of archetypal pots, and no matter whether I changed my material, so this was changing to a high-fired earthenware clay and using terra sigillata and referencing all sorts of Bronze Age Mediterranean ceramics, or whether I changed to applied painted decoration with underglaze and then glazing over the top. Here the idea again was, as say with the bowl, as the foot of the bowl narrows, the intervals between the banding get smaller, and then as the bowl opens up, the intervals get larger. So again, it was thinking of ideas of form and surface. But no matter how much I tried to kind of work around these ideas, I started to kind of come face to face with the inevitable prospect that really it wasn't enough to make pots that you looked at, or maybe even picked up in a slightly self-conscious way, but pots that actually could be used. So in the mid to late 80s, I started to make thrown tableware. There's no other word for it, I suppose. Now, it was so far removed from what everyone else was doing. I'd started to kind of have exhibitions, and even kind of some public collections had bought work. So I was I was in a little groove, and things were kind of moving along nicely on one level. But I just couldn't kind of quite square what I was doing with what I was, in a rather inarticulate way, thinking I should be doing. And I started to make porcelain tableware. And I remember taking it along to a very kind of important gallery at the time, whose director was like a cross between, I don't know, Catherine the Great of Russia and Attila the Hun. She was like an incredibly intimidating person. And I went to show her the first cups and saucers I made, and I was kind of quaking in my boots and thinking, oh God, you know, this is going to be awful, and, you know, what's she going to think? What are other people going to think? Julian is so broke, he's so hard up, he's got to make pots for use. But it was really interesting because this intimidating gallerist was actually very responsive. And interestingly enough, the first things that I showed through the gallery, people were also responsive. And that was really, really, really interesting. And that was in about 86, 87. So I can't stress enough how unfashionable it was to make pottery then. The world of British ceramics was kind of broadly broken down into two camps. There was one that was represented by a kind of postmodernist camp of young potters. Well, they didn't call themselves potters. That was far too kind of, you know, awful a term. They called themselves vessel makers. Makers as a term is endemic in Britain, and that emerged in this period because the idea of craft or pottery was seen as such an embarrassment that other terms were invented. Craftsman or craftswoman was too long and too gender specific. When I left the RCA in 81, I came face to face with, I had to describe myself as in a particular way, and I thought, well, how do I talk about myself? And I'd made the decision to call myself a potter, which was, you know, superficially an embarrassment. Anyway, so coming back to this tableware, it was really interesting that there was a positive response to it. And it was a response from galleries through to people buying work. So if you think about 86, 87, we're at the height of the kind of art boom of that period. So, you know, neo-expressionist figurative revival of Julian Schnabel and Clemente and Chia, and that was the world that we were living in. The zeitgeist was very much that kind of postmodernist, neo-expressionist rediscovery of painting, something that had been thought to be dead in the 1970s. There was an exhibition at the Tate which declared that painting is dead. This was the height of kind of the first round of conceptual art. The primitive practice of daubing pigment upon woven fabric. Painting was something that was consigned to history. But sure enough, a decade later, you know, a new generation of younger painters rediscovered painting, and critics and galleries and everyone fell in, and it became this huge kind of boom and money-making kind of machine. So that was very much, as I say, the kind of the dominant kind of view of the day. And again, if I'm going to be kind of trying to kind of create a flavour, you had, as I say, two camps. So you had kind of young, brave Turks who were blurring boundaries, breaking down the distinction between craft and fine art, abandoning ideas of use and function. And then you had your very traditional English potters who were effectively kind of followers of Leach, what's called the Anglo-Oriental tradition. So people who made stoneware pots in Temuku glazes and celadons, and maybe slipware pots with earthenware and low-fired slip training and earthenware glazes. And these two groups, that was it. It was kind of never the twain shall meet. One group beatified Leach. You couldn't say anything against him. The other group demonized him. And there was very little space in between. there was actually no space. Camps were so entrenched. Views were, I think, so narrow. And I was trying to kind of negotiate a way. I was fairly young, and I'd kind of grown up in London and been through an art school education, and I should have been in that kind of postmodernist camp, but I didn't feel it was something that was appropriate for me, and I certainly couldn't feel any empathy with what I felt was the narrow strictures of the Leach School. And so I kind of started to kind of look more to Europe and people such as Lucy Ray and Hans Koper, so people who came out of a European modernist tradition, if you like, one that was set by Hans Hofmann and people like that. So the idea of making pots was central. I couldn't dress them up in Temuku glazes or do all the kind of Anglo-Oriental stuff. It just wasn't part of my makeup. And this was an image that was taken for a publication, and I really liked the image because it showed the cup in use. It wasn't a kind of static photograph, and it didn't show the person's face, which was good. It just showed the act of actually drinking, and it threw the emphasis on the hand and on the object and on the use, on that kind of dynamic use. A few more years passed, and I moved to a different studio in London, which I shared with a potter called Eben de Waal, who I'm sure you've all heard of. And Eben was the first potter in the UK who I actually felt an empathy with, because we were both, there was an empathy of approach. The work is quite different, and is diversified even more since we stopped sharing after 10 years. But we were both interested in trying to recontextualize pottery within a modern idiom. We were also both interested in trying to look at the history and the development of studio pottery, something that these two polarized camps weren't really involved in and weren't really interested in. What annoys me about so many Leach followers is that they take supposed truths that were uttered by Leach himself as absolutely gospel, and it's repeated, and another generation goes by, and they become cast in stone, and they become kind of inviolable tenets. They don't actually go back necessarily and look at the context that Leach made those remarks in and evaluate them within practice of Leach's period. And then, if you like, the kind of progressive group, as opposed to the traditionalists, it also suited them to demonize Leach because they had a whipping post, they had a bogeyman. And if you've got a bogeyman, you've got a kind of an enemy. And it's a great position to have to then justify the work that you're doing in response, in antagonism, in response to. And as I say, there was very little space in between. So this last image here, I had a two-person show with the artist Andy Goldsworthy, who you might know about. I think this was 99. And Goldsworthy, this was in a commercial gallery, a private gallery in Edinburgh. And Goldsworthy was doing some of his installation work, a few kind of small installations in the gallery with bits of broken wood. And then he did one of his clay walls in a second room. And I kind of worried about this and think, Goldsworthy was, he was the favourite artist of all the kind of weekend supplement magazines for the Guardian and, the Sunday Times and things. And kind of everyone's favourite artist at the time. And, well, here's me making pots and there's Goldsworthy doing, what do I do? And I kind of worried and worried and worried. And then I thought, well, actually, do I run away from it? Do I try and kind of compete? No, I don't. And I thought, well, maybe Goldsworthy's interested in the idea of time and that impact of time on materials and on site specificity. So maybe I just kind of celebrate what I do and I make a dinner service. Because that, in a way, has all the dynamics of a Goldsworthy installation. It's site-specific, it changes over time, the objects move, and if you photograph that over a period of, say, you know, a 4-hour meal, that would become an animated, alive, changing object. And so I thought, well, instead of running away in fear, I'll kind of try and celebrate what I do. So I carried on making tableware and trying not to do tableware and present it in a way that was kind of like interior magazine shoots and good housekeeping and things like that. About this time, I also, I also started a PhD. It didn't start off as a PhD, it started off as a research proposal. And because I was so fed up with the kind of polarized debates and the kind of silo mentality of groups of English ceramics who would kind of lob insults back and forth to each other and quote Leach, you know, in a kind of positive or derogatory way. But really it was a bit like Chinese whispers. There wasn't a great deal of kind of informed commentary there. So I put a proposal together to go back now as a mature student to the RCA and to investigate the history and development of English studio ceramics. There'd been very little writing at this stage on English studio ceramics, really, really good writing. I think I started the PhD in '94, and that was something like 5 years before Tanya Howard's book, and it was maybe about the same length of time before Edmund's monograph on Leach. Amazingly enough, there hadn't been a monograph on Leach written in the mid-90s. So the interesting thing is the kind of discipline of studio ceramics was very under-theorized, it was under-researched. And as a result, I think that was a kind of a weak and impoverished position. So I started a PhD, and in the end it turned out to be what's called a historiography, which was a history of writing on English studio pottery between 1910 and 1940. The reality is I read everything that was published on pottery and ceramics from 1900 to 1940. Everything. All the newspapers, magazines, books, catalogue essays. And whenever I mentioned it to anyone, you know, the standard reply was a joke, well, that would take you about 10 minutes then, because everyone assumed that there was nothing that was written. And of course, surprise, surprise, it turned out to be the exact opposite. There was an abundance of material, and there was an extraordinary amount of really, really interesting writing that totally overturned my whole understanding of studio pottery and ceramics and art. So, if you bear with me for a second, there's a kind of a myth that Leach came back to Britain in 1920 with young Hamada and brought the glories of Oriental pottery to the West. And once our eyes were open to these beautiful objects, that was the beginning of studio pottery. Now that's a myth that was written by Leach himself and perpetuated by his followers. The exact opposite was true, and I won't go into it now because it's a big subject, but all the leading modernist art critics in Britain in the first part of the 20th century were interested in Chinese ceramics. They were interested in English Gothic pottery, the great kind of canons of the Anglo-Oriental school of stoneware and slitware were already established and identified and started to be theorized before Leach came back to Britain. They were already in currency. And Roger Fry wrote about, the first modernist art critic to write about Sung Dynasty pottery in 1910. He did the same in 1914. And Bell and Frank Rutter and all the great kind of early modernist critics were interested in pottery and a whole wealth of other forms of artistic practice, because this was the early days of modernism. It was when ideas and debates about art practice were opening up and were all inclusive. It was just gloriously interesting. And as a result, it was liberating because I could get rid of the agenda of the Leach school or the kind of anti-Leach school. These were a series of thrown and constructed jars. And I felt once I kind of was in possession of knowledge and facts, it was empowering. It enabled me to kind of buck the trends, really. And I felt that pottery wasn't cast in stone. There weren't any right or wrong ways to go about making it. It was a discipline that artists could interpret in whatever way they felt most appropriate for the time that they were living in. And so work changed, and I started to kind of throw and collage forms. And in about 2000, 2001, a combination of a variety of things. I started to make pots that I sited on ceramic plinths. I call them grounds. That's my kind of made-up word. And I did this for a variety of reasons. There was a very well-known potter called Reginald Wells, who no one else knows about now. And I saw an image of Reginald Wells's work from 1924. And this was one of the pioneering potters who was referencing Chinese ceramics, which he loved. And in China, valuable pots were put on carved wooden stands. And Reginald Wells and Leach and State Murray, they all did this at the beginning. And then one day I found an image which was Reginald Wells. He put pots on a tray, and I just thought that was so interesting. Because once I got over the baggage of the kind of the Leach agenda, as I said, I felt liberating. And of course, the Leach agenda, which is there's a kind of a moral imperative and there's a kind of spiritual dimension. The idea of use and the idea that pots have to be cheap. They have to be cheap enough to be able to use, and then it doesn't matter if you break them. Now, that's not really a kind of great incentive to kind of put your heart and soul and your best ideas into work, that it's so cheap that it's kind of disposable and throwaway. And it's also very disingenuous, because the first of the great kind of pioneering potters, they didn't show their work in craft fairs. They showed their work in Bond Street, and they showed their work for extraordinary amounts of money. But by today's standards, tens of thousands of pounds. So Leach was so disingenuous. And as I say, I found this image of Wells's tribute to ancient Chinese pottery that he was referencing. And so this was kind of almost like a tribute to the proto or pioneering studio potters of Britain. And it was very interesting because pots are not just made, the idea, I hate the term functional pottery because it's so restrictive. It's kind of so one-dimensional, if there is such a thing. Pots have always been multifaceted in their kind of, in their reach. The Sung Dynasty, the period that Leach himself absolutely kind of championed, pots were made for the emperor. They were the products of enormously sophisticated systems of patronage, vast amounts of money and input. And they were made as much for display and metaphorical, symbolic value as they were for use. So this idea that pots are kind of somehow just kind of, simple, kind of rudimentary objects, I felt was actually a denial of their kind of historical position. So I started to make these pots on grounds, and it was very interesting because there was also a kind of a secret agenda. I remember I was in the studio and Edmund and we were throwing on wheels and talking, and one day I was making cups and saucers, and I was getting something like £25 for a cup and saucer, which is not very much money. And I said out aloud one day in great kind of annoyance, I want to make one cup and saucer for £150 instead of 6 for £150, and then went back to work. And this idea of trying to present pots in a different way, by putting it on a ground or a plinth, you're you're kind of elevating it. You're breaking a kind of an expectation. And one of the reasons was, how can I make people look again at very, very simple things? A great strength of pottery is its familiarity. A great weakness is it becomes invisible as a result of that familiarity. And so the plinth was a way of breaking that. And Gombrich talks about frames and paintings as a disruption of space. There's pictorial space within a painting or print or drawing, and then there's a real space that painting sits in a room. And the frame for Gombrich is this kind of interval between the two. It disrupts the regularity of space, and that's what plinths do for sculpture, and that's what these plinths or grounds did for the pots. And I was able to make the things that I really believed in, and the simplest thing, which was a cup without a handle, a teapot, a kind of a domestic object which supposedly has very little currency in the kind of world of, you know, progressive avant-gardism. I could present and actually try and make people look at in a new way. So the idea of pots on grounds developed, and I'm still working with it now. As I say, it was liberating to go back and do this research. It was empowering. And one of the things that came out of it was I discovered a critic that no one remembers now called W.A. Thorpe. And he was a really, really good writer. And he wrote brilliantly in kind of a modernist approach in the 1920s and 30s. He didn't write many things, but there was one article he wrote, and he wrote about pottery and this relationship with architecture. And he coined this wonderful term that pots were volumes within voids. They were both kind of essentially human art forms, and they were both about the articulation of space, and they were both concerned with domestic space and kind of, you know, our lives. But one was on a large scale and was the volume, and pots were on a small scale and they were the void. Other way around. The architectural space was the void, and the pots, the objects, were the volumes that operated in this space. So this was a formal approach from a 1920s modernist critic. But this relationship between pottery and architecture really has stuck with me, and is something I explored. And this was a private commission for a client, which took 2 years to make. And I took this idea of pots on grounds at her invitation. It was a very generous kind of act of patronage, and she gave me a space in her room, in her a new house. And this was a funny space. This was a kind of like a little kind of strange connecting corridor with a proscenium arch as a front onto the stairwell of the house. And when I saw it, that was the space. But I worked with foam board and cut up bits of balsa wood and then made little models. And I made a maquette of what and worked out what I could do in this space to kind of clothe this space, architectural space, in pots, to kind of take the pots from floor to ceiling. So these are, as you can see, I had to get my daughter to help me because my fingers were too big to make the kind of little tiny cups out of Play-Doh. Do you have that here? So these were, as I say, bits of balsa wood. And I think working to scale models is something I do now. I plan my exhibitions out with scale models, and you can understand space and form and volume in a way that's just so direct and to the point. And this is just an image of making a ground, making a large ground. I had to develop a new palette of colours and so these are tests of new colours, and that's the final commission. But it could never be seen from one viewpoint. It was a very complex space, and so I decided, like you can never see the back or the underneath of a pot, you have to pick it up and turn it around in the hand. I decided I would treat that space as a space that you could never see everything from one viewpoint, and you had to kind of look around the corner and up and down to find out what was going on. So that's one viewpoint, and that's a detail there. That's another viewpoint from one side. There's a detail again. These are all made of ceramic. They're kind of stupidly hard to make. That big blue plinth or ground was 6 months to make from beginning to end, because it's slab built, and I, in a kind of rather OCD way, wanted it to be absolutely perfectly regular, and so it is pretty regular. And the grounds there are all ceramic, and the grounds on the wall, they're all made of ceramic as well, and they have hidden brackets. And these, again, are details of the work. And she's a collector of pots, and she loves pots. And so this was a celebration of pots. And it was in a space where the light changed dramatically throughout the course of the day. And so it was a fantastic commission. I stretched her patience like crazy and took over 2 years to make it, as I say. But in the end, I think she was happy. This is my current studio, just for a little bit of kind of information. So I moved again. Emma and I, we let the lease of our previous studio go because it became incredibly expensive, and so I bought a studio in London and then kind of did it up. It was an old mechanic's garage, and this is a space now where I work, and I can kind of control the environment, and that's really important. I think if you're an artist, your space, your environment is really important, like a writer's desk. This is the equivalent of me lining up my pencils in a kind of, in the morning ritual. And I have assistants, because I found that people who want to learn about making pots kind of get discouraged at college. Very rarely I do kind of an occasional day's teaching, and very often if I'm doing a crit and someone tells me, oh yes, this is a piece of work about this and that and whatever, but really I wanted to do something different. And I said, well, what did you want to do? And they said, well, I wanted to make pots, but my teachers, the lecturers, they didn't think it was kind of interesting enough. So what's happened is that both Edmund and I individually have taken on a series of apprentices over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's a symbiotic relationship. The apprentices develop their own work, and in return they help me out for a little bit of the week, for about half the week, and there's a kind of quid pro quo relationship. And now there's quite a number of people who've come to the studio, and some have been there for 2 years, the longest is for 5 years, and they work with me, and I mentor them and help them kind of develop their work and help them launch themselves into the world of galleries and exhibiting and selling, and so that their time in the studio is like a halfway house between college and having to cope with the real world, and it's a very difficult transition to make. And then this is some recent work, and these are a series of more recent pots on grounds. I have a photographer who I really like and who I've kind of worked with. And one of the reasons I like her is because she really focuses in on the kind of material qualities of work. And it's so difficult to convey the nuances and subtleties of ceramics, of clay in photography. And that's one reason, there's a huge impact of photography on, how ceramics is developed. And it's about things looking good on film, but what Jan does is she gets right into the kind of into the material itself. So again, these are series of pots on grounds, and these are clays which I make, I collect, I kind of obsessively kind of collect clays, and this is a kind of a naturally occurring brick clay that I fire to a kind of silly high temperature, and it starts to kind of melt. And then I have other clays which again are naturally occurring, like that red teapot there, which is a kind of high firing stoneware for the geeks amongst the audience. It kind of fires to a very high temperature, but it retains that wonderful iron red colour. But then I make a lot of my clays as well. That's a porcelain. But these clays here, the clay on the left is a basalt, a black clay that's a kind of homage to Wedgwood. And I make these clays, and so I actually, on the whole, I use a lot of unglazed clays. And I do that because, again, this idea of touch. and I have to introduce a word here for you. How many people know the word haptic or haptical? Fantastic, fantastic. Again, everyone else who doesn't, go and look up and read about the definition of haptic. It is the quintessential word to describe the material arts. It's a Greek word, and the sister word to it is optic. So optic is obviously how we kind of see the world visually and negotiate our way through the world by sight. Haptic is the equivalent for touch, how we physically kind of negotiate the world. And for anyone who's interested in making material art, be it sculpture or ceramics or wooden furniture, haptic is the word. The haptical qualities are the very things that define and embody the interest and the beauty of material art. And again, Jan is able to kind of capture this in her photographs. So I work with everything from porcelain, which I will glaze, through to fine-bodied clays I make, through to very impure, unrefined, naturally dug clays, and kind of put them together. And again, it's possibly a bit OCD, but I make the grounds out of clay because there's a dialogue. There's a kind of a dialogue and a relationship between the object and the means by which it's displayed. And as well as Wells, I went to a recreation of Brancusi's studio about the same time as I started, when I was looking at Wells. And it was in Paris, outside the Pompidou Centre, and I knew about, from art history, about Brancusi and how he integrated the sculpture and the plinth into the same work. But it was going to the studio, which was a recreation. It's not a kind of nasty Disney recreation. It was a really beautiful recreation. And I got it. There's a difference between kind of intellectually knowing something, and then there's a difference between actually really understanding it and kind of, intuitively understanding it. And I got it. I finally kind of understood about the way objects and the plinth and how they kind of relate to each other work. So that was the other factor, along with Wells. So there's a dialogue between the pots and the plinth, and they're both kind of reliant on each other. Well, they're not, of course, because these will exist without the cups, and the teapots and objects will exist without the plinths. But the combination of the two somehow adds up to a greater addition than the sum of the individual parts, the old Gestalt thing. So these are mixtures of, or combination of work. Now I'm going to go back to reading the text, because in reading the text I can make sure that I don't forget the things I really want to say. So I apologise for a kind of slight kind of change and shift here. This was the exhibition that Dana referred to. So it's toured for about 18 months to 4 venues. I'm going to show slides from 3 of the venues because I didn't get the images from the last venue in time for this talk. But those 3 venues are kind of more than enough in terms of making the point. And there we go. It's self-evident, what the exhibition is about. So this was an exhibition that was conceived as a tour, not necessarily to take it as a complete and self-contained package to a number of venues, but to cite it in different contexts where it could be edited and adapted in order to draw out different themes. This was an attempt to explore how art can mediate death, mediate our understanding of death, a subject I believe that is so fundamental to how we understand and live our lives. I first proposed the idea to a curator in the year 2000. The show finally opened in Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art in the north of England in July 2012. Mima's permanent collection is not on display, but held in store, so it is a museum whose identity is shaped by their temporary exhibition programme. Held in a 4,500 square foot exemplar of white cube space. This was an opportunity to frame work in a type of space which Brian Doherty describes in his book Inside the White Cube as one where and I quote, "the outside world must not come in. Windows are usually sealed off. Walls are painted white. The ceilings become the source of light. The art is free, as the saying used to go, to take on its own life." Without a doubt, MIMA is a great space. The 4 interconnected rooms enabled me to establish specific themes within the exhibition. Utilising a 10-metre high space for the display of this work, which is called a columbarium. There we are. So the display of this piece called Columbarium, and direct people through the 4 rooms of the galleries in ways as to construct a narrative that ended up with one work, Reliquy for a Common Man, that was a conclusion to the exhibition, but also hopefully a beginning. I shall come back to this in a little while. So this was the first room in the gallery, and it has this extraordinary 10 metre, 30 odd feet high space, and I just really wanted to utilise it. And columbarium is a term for buildings in the archaic period that were made to house the dead. They were houses of the dead, and they were beautiful columbariums with funerary jars lining the walls, and sometimes buildings where there were just hundreds of niches. And it's a tradition that still kind of carries on in certainly parts of southern Europe. So the first room was entitled Columbarium. The second room was entitled Inhumation, which is the archaeological term for burial of the human body. And these were a series of life-size sarcophagi made with lead lids. And then there were some drawings as well, which is the first time I've shown drawings since I was a student. And there were sarcophagi for adults, but also for children, because sadly children also die. The third room was entitled Corpus, the name for the body, and it was a series of life-size throne jars, lidded jars, and playing on the idea of the human body and anthropomorphic nature of pottery, which I'll just read about in a little while. So again, this was the third room. That was a fortuitous photograph because that member of the public just happened to be standing there, and the shape was just wonderful. And then this was the final room, which was Reliquy for a Common Man, but I'll come back and talk about that at the end. I'm just going to break from talking about the talk, because to make this work I have to go into brick factories, because that's the only place where it's big enough to actually make really kind of life-size ceramics. So it's an ordinary brick factory, and this is the yard of the factory. The pots are thrown. They're coiled and thrown over. It takes about a month to kind of throw a pot from beginning to end, and I try and keep things as direct, as simple as possible. And so I add a coil and throw it, and then let it dry, and then add another coil and throw it, and so on, until I get up to a height that is about the size before firing of an adult. And the great thing about brick factories is that you can call on forklift trucks and people for help, because these things are heavy and they're difficult to kind of maneuver. This is loading it into a kiln. This is taken from inside the kiln. So believe it or not, it's a kiln about the size of a house, and this is the other side of it. And so this is just a picture of one jar in a firing with about 60,000 bricks. And then this is another factory, and this is making the sarcophagi. So some of these were coiled, some of these were made from slabs. Another reason for working in a brick factory is they have the space, they have the equipment, but they also have strong clays, and those clays, because they're designed for making bricks, and bricks are resilient objects and tough kind of tough things, They're often good clays for making large-scale work. Plus, I really appreciate and like the qualities of the kind of unrefined material. So this is now coming back to the second venue of Quietus. The show then moved to the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, over on the west side of the UK. I wanted to contextualise the work within a historical continuum, in effect honour the museum parts that I've spent a considerable part of my life looking at and trying to learn from. Working with curators and archaeologists, I brought Neolithic, Bronze Age and Roman funerary pots, complete with cremated human remains, into the exhibition. And here we see the columbarium reconfigured, and then that's the reliquary jar that I mentioned. And then this was a brand new, never been exhibited before, but a brand new jar, funerary urn, as the archaeologists call them, a Roman one that had been recently found and dug up, and I was lucky enough to be able to kind of bring into the exhibition and display. Conversations with the archaeologists were truly inspiring, not only in opening a window onto the past, but in understanding different funerary rites and types of burial practice, which, without being overly sentimental, helps to unlock a time that is perhaps not so remote or different as we tend to think. So this is a detail of the jar. It was discovered when someone's spade kind of made a clunking noise, and then they realised there was a pot, and they managed to get most of it out. These two jars in front are actually Bronze Age pots, and so those are in the region of about 3,500 years old. And I just wanted to kind of make the link that I'm not going to argue, because it would be extraordinarily naive to do so, that we're the same as Bronze Age people, or our values or our kind of philosophical view of the world is the same. We don't know. It's obviously a kind of pre-literate culture. But actually, I think you can glean an enormous amount from objects that civilizations leave behind. And is there a fantastic difference between funerary jars that were made 3,000 years ago and, well, the ones that I'm trying to make now? And as well as bringing them into the exhibition, I took my work into the archaeological galleries. So I was able to cite my work with the archaeologists in the archaeological galleries, which again was trying to kind of make a link. I'm not going to argue that there is a thing such as universalism that is as simple as that, but I'm going to argue that we can't dismiss it or ignore it completely. And this was, again, a large size sarcophagus, and it was displayed opposite a Roman stone sarcophagus on the other side of the gallery. The show then moved to, the third venue was Winchester Cathedral in the south of England, one of the most important churches in Europe, where the building started around the year 1080, so that's over 1,000 years old. This was a wonderful building to place objects designed to hold the human body in death, an uncertain stage in our existence that the church has been central in mediating for so long. It also gave real meaning to the term quietus, a word which describes the moment of transition when the soul is released from life into death. From the modern temple of the White Cube to Gothic Cathedral, Winchester could not have been a greater contrast than Mima. As a crucible for all the great rites of passage over 1,000 years, Winchester provided a context for what one member of the staff described the church's role in christenings, weddings and funerals as the hatching, matching and dispatching of our congregation. Irrespective of one's religious views, the cathedral is a vast building full of memorials, tombs and chapels, and like Cardiff, provided a historical context where one could juxtapose contemporary work. again, a difference with history that's not so great as we think. So this was the 12th century addition to the 11th century building. The Romanesque building is below, and this is the Gothic. This is the Gothic addition. And it was absolutely extraordinary how different the work looked in Winchester to Cathedral than Mima. I edited it and I didn't show everything in all of the venues, and so the show kind of had a different rhythm in each of the spaces, as well as the sighting of it in relationship to kind of architectural or other kind of points of interest. So this is one thing Winchester is known for, is the largest span of medieval tiled flooring in Europe. And bizarrely, I fell in love with these tiles when I was a student. They're called encaustic tiles. And it was an extraordinary kind of privilege, in a way, to be able to show work in the cathedral, but also to site the work on these floors. And made of the same materials that the actual, that the pots were made of as well. And that's St. Swithin's tomb, and St. Swithin is the patron saint of Winchester. And this was the columbarium, which was on the screen around the high altar. And two children's sarcophagi in one of the small chapels. This was called the Guardian Angels Chapel, which was very appropriate. And then two pieces in the crypt. Again, an extraordinary kind of wonderful space, to be able to exhibit it. And what was interesting was that one of the reasons, as I said, this interest in architecture. So I have to say, my kind of interest in making this work is multi-stranded. But it was interesting that this is a huge volume. This is absolutely ginormous. And it's interesting that the sheer kind of visceral quality of clay and this amazing material can actually hold spaces as big as that, which is just, so, incredibly big. But why a tour in the first place? As I have stated, the core of my interest is in making pots, a term I prefer to use rather than ceramics. The term ceramic describes a material, whereas pottery, which is a medium-specific discipline that uses clay, describes a genre of objects. Objects that operate on many levels, from the symbolic to the utilitarian. However, there is a paradox in making and exhibiting pottery in exhibitions, especially when placed behind glass or in a formal space of museums. A paradox that applies to much art that encompasses practical use. As soon as a useful object is exhibited, it becomes denuded of the very energies that give it meaning. Tactile qualities become meaningless because the hand becomes separated from the object. Questions of temporality become redundant because objects become marooned in a twilight of inactivity. And most importantly of all, social context is lost. The very human activity that shaped them and brought about their existence is excluded. It is not to say that this is all there is to appreciating pots, but the consequences of losing these elements have had a profound impact on the wider identity and perception of studio ceramics, at least since the Second World War. So the archaic pottery of Cardiff, the medieval tombs of Winchester, became prompts in a process of re-examining whether contemporary art could fulfill a role in mediating death, or what the British philosopher Simon Critchley calls the last great taboo of modern life. And why pots? I believe art, in this case pots, are able to mediate this taboo, to turn something difficult into something affirmative and celebratory, to express ideas and emotions, to make sense of and give meaning. One of the central aims of Quietus is to try and demonstrate what Philip Rawson referred to as the transformative nature of pottery. This is a long quote, but I think it's worthwhile reading, so bear with me. He discusses ceramics as a primal interweaving of matter, human action and symbol. Something undeniably material, wearing the evidence of its material nature in its visible and tangible forms and attributes, which at the same time contains so much projected into it from man's daily life and experience at all levels that it can seem to him like a projection of his own bodily identity. It thus becomes an eternal, external testimony to his existence. Quietus explores the relationship between pottery and the human body. The metaphor of the vessel as body has been explicit throughout much of ceramic practice, from the Bronze Age onwards. There's a wonderful story about the archaeologist and those early Bronze Age pots, but again, another day. It is clearly evident in the way we use bodily terms to describe the constituent parts of pots, such as foot, neck, lip, shoulder, belly and waist. I believe one of the core themes of pottery is its somatic identity, an identity illustrated by the analogy of the vessel as a container, its ability to hold, and the role of the body as a physical container, and its ability to hold what some people call the soul or the human spirit. Historically, ceramic vessels have played a central role in rituals surrounding death. While pots commonly play a part in sustaining the living body by containing and offering food and drink, breaking bread with family and friends, funerary ware establishes a different set of relationships. On a practical level, it houses or sustains the body after life by containing it in death. But on a symbolic level, cinerary jars and sarcophagi, which represent the idea of the vessel as a body through their role as containers, also open new frames of reference that further extend corporal identity. By physically housing the body it symbolically represents, funerary ware reunites both symbol and object, and, in the process, turns the language of anthropomorphism full circle. Subject and representation become united. Idea transforms into material. Material transforms into idea. Intellectual construct becomes tangible. And returning to Kaji's point at the beginning, this work does not carry a message. It is the message. And talking of Kaji, I'd like to pick up on one of his main concerns, the importance of materials and processes. The methods involved in making these pots reinforce this theme of transformation. The elemental rhythms of ceramics, from the digging of clay to the use of heat to fire pots, also parallels the cycles of life and death and practices of burial and cremation. Creation myths repeatedly refer to the forming of the human body from the earth, while many burial practices also stress the importance of returning the body to the ground from where it originated, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The process of taking the clay from the ground, shaping it into funerary ware, and then in turning it back into the ground, mirrors the act of inhumation, the archaeological term for burial, as I said earlier, that's prevalent in so many cultures. The firing of different clays, or the term we commonly use, bodies, is achieved by exposure to extreme heat, which alters the nature of the clay through a chemical change into a permanent and fixed material. Again, this alchemical transformation of clay mirrors the ritual and process of cremation, where the human body is transformed through fire after death. The profound pragmatism of pottery underscores the fact that we live our lives through ideas and emotions grounded in a material world. I do not subscribe to the moral imperative for pottery advanced by Bernard Leach during the mid-20th century. If anything, I think Leach hijacked and derailed the fledgling studio pottery movement that was shaping the material identity of English modernism in tandem with painting and sculpture. But perhaps that is a discussion for another talk. Today, engagement, performativity, participation, audience interaction are buzzwords in discussing current artistic practice, as demonstrated by the conceptual artist Tino Segal's recent nomination for the Turner Prize and the commission for the Turbine Hall last year. Those are probably the two biggest kind of most prestigious art events you can have in England. The Turner Prize is an annual prize awarded by the Tate, and the Turbine Hall is a massive space that's given over for artists to do their installations. And Tino Segal is kind of very popular at the moment. It is true that his work does question the relationship between audience and art. But what is interesting for me is this still happens within the museum or the art gallery, the modern cathedral. In contrast, pottery is a stealth art. The use of an apparently simple cup and saucer, for example, involves an appraisal of two interrelated forms, often graphic treatment or glaze, a consideration of ergonomics, tactile qualities, kinesthetic appreciation, architectural specificity, conveyance of taste and smell, and, of course, aesthetic discernment. What is significant is this takes place on a regular basis, inside and outside of the home. And of course you'll be experiencing this later tonight when you eat your evening meal. Is this union of hand and eye significant? We humans are physical creatures who live in a material world, and I believe art should reflect this. We do not eat food with our eyes, wear clothes by looking at them, somehow move across the earth without coming into contact with the ground. The list is endless. Almost every human action is a physical interaction with the world we live in, or to coin Oliver Sacks's phrase, we experience the world through the hand of the mind. Sacks also reminds us that one does not see or sense or perceive in isolation. Perception is always linked to behaviour and movement, to reaching out and exploring the world. So much contemporary art prioritises the eye to the detriment of the other senses, that disciplines such as pottery become significant in offering alternative takes on the world. And in an increasingly digital age, this is a factor that may become even more important. By engaging with and playing a part within the social fabric of human culture, pots become part of what I call an embodied or active narrative. They don't just comment or tell a story, but their agency actively shapes our actions. All art has a social dimension, but it is often highly selective. High modernist art regarded the idea of use as a constraint on the artist's imagination, an attitude that persists today. As the British sculptor Tony Cragg wrote about his friend and fellow sculptor Richard Deacon, who's having a one-man show retrospective at Tate Modern at the moment. And this is a quote. This is a quote of Tony Cragg. Our reality, that which informs us, is made of useful things. Therefore, utilitarianism is a harsh censor of reality. How so? If the relationship of form and content, not to mention meaning, is central to any discussion about art, then when the form is being limited, so is the content, and of course meaning. Or as another British artist, Gavin Turk, put it, as soon as an object becomes useless, it becomes useful. So obviously I take exception to that kind of view. I happen to think that when art operates within a social context, it heightens meaning by adding an extra dimension of possibility that can enrich both the artwork, its interpretation, and social life at large. And this applies whether one makes cups and plates or funerary ware. As the great American pragmatic philosopher John Dewey wrote some 70 years ago, that's a long quote, but it's such a brilliant quote I will read it out in full. It is mere ignorance that leads then to the supposition that connection of art and aesthetic perception with experience signifies a lowering of their significance and dignity. Experience, in the degree in which it is experience, is heightened vitality. Instead of signifying being shut up within one's own private feelings and sensation, it signifies active and alert commerce with the world. At its height, it signifies complete interpenetration of self and the world of objects and events. The final piece in Quietus is a memorial to one individual, which I called Reliquy for a Common Man. This was made for Leslie James Cox, who lived between 1926 to 2008, and he was my father-in-law's brother. And this is the room at Mima. And I gave a whole room over to one pot, and it was a large room. And it was the final room of the four. So, and you went from the final room of the fourth room, final room here, back to the beginning where the columbarium was. In an attempt to overcome this paradox of exhibiting a useful thing, I used audio-visual elements in an exhibition for the first time. I must stress that they're definitely not artworks in themselves, that they have a supporting role to reveal the person behind the memorial for those people who didn't know him. I wanted to animate Leslie through movement that we collected from old home Super 8 films. I wanted to show the progression of his life through a simple series of family photographs and reveal the timbre of his voice through a recorded interview he gave a decade before he died. I wanted to reveal the life of the person who we knew and loved, the person in the jar. This memorial reinforces the theme of transformation through the incorporation of his cremated ash into an actual artwork. As you know, ceramic ingredients are composites of different chemicals, and after cremation, human ash is simply reduced to materials such as calcium oxide, phosphate, and magnesium oxide. After receiving Leslie's ashes back from the crematorium, where they had gone through a cremulator, that's a machine to kind of grind the big bits of the bone down to a smaller size, I then ground them down to a fine powder and mixed them with other ceramic materials to make a bone china from which I threw a cinerary jar to hold his remaining ash. I don't know, but does everyone realise that bone ash is actually made from calcined or burnt bones, normally ox bones? So it's not just a kind of a funny term, it is a literal term. This was not a gruesome or morbid act. It was an attempt to literally embody the person who I was memorialising in as complete a way as possible. On the whole, memorials memorialise in the abstract. They make reference to people who once lived. This pot marked Leslie's life by containing all of that was left of him after he died. But it is still possible to reach out and literally touch part of him. I know he's died. His life and energy have left us, but part of him will always be physically present. And there is a wonderful irony and conclusion to this story. Reliquy for a Common Man has now been purchased by a public collection in the UK. A devout atheist and humanist who challenged all establishment authority, who was a member of a wonderfully utopian and an obscure political party, who only lived in public housing because he didn't believe in owning property, and wore Birkenstock sandals for 20 years before anyone else had heard of them, supplemented by socks in the winter, I may add. He will remain in the public domain in perpetuity. I hope this memorial will demonstrate how pottery can marry concept and material into work that engages with issues through use. While utilitarian function alone is not an indicator of value, when combined with appropriate content, I believe it can create a heightened level of engagement and enable art to move out of the white cube and back into our lives. So it's a very simple jar. It's just like many of the jars in the columbarium. And Glenn Adams, who was the head of research, wrote an essay for the catalogue. And because you went from the fourth room back into the first room where the columbarium was, and this was exactly what I had planned to do, he said he went back and he saw the columbarium again, and instead of seeing it just as another artistic display, you know, a kind of installation of objects, he then saw it as a collection of 130 individuals, as Leslie's jar was. And that was exactly the point that I was trying to put across. Leslie became the everyman of the exhibition. Aha. Damn. Well, it worked earlier. This is just a little, it's a 55, well, that's really disappointing. It's a 55 second. Well, there has to be a technical hitch in every talk, doesn't there? I just wanted, what was important about it, sorry, I'll try for like another second and then give up if it doesn't work. And there was another little video, which was the video of photographs of Leslie as moving from a young boy to an older man. And then there was also the audio track of his voice. And as I say, these were supporting elements to try and unlock the person who was in the jar. And that's the end of my talk. And thank you very much for your patience.